Final Fantasy is famous as a tenuously linked anthology of games. Elements such as summonable beings, a character called Cid, and crystals are just some of the examples of what recurs and binds them on a narrative, thematic, or symbolic level. Yet looking at a broader, less discussed recurring element, and in this case specifically magic, we have something that has historically worked across both narrative and mechanistic aspects of the games, and we can see a more tumultuous application over time that has, over the past decade in particular, radically changed from its original use and application in the games, and has been met with some criticisms as a result. So, what's going on with magic in Final Fantasy? What do recent games indicate about its uses in future gameplay design? And does Final Fantasy, on its current trajectory, warrant magic at all? Now, from a setting and lore perspective, magic is part and parcel of Final Fantasy. It has featured in various capacities over the years, and it persists throughout most, if not all, of the worlds and stories, whether it's the futuristic Final Fantasy VIII with its paramagic, or the likes of Final Fantasy IX with its class-specific magic-wielding mages and summoners. So this aspect of magic implementation across the games is generally down to personal preference for the player, and more often than not, it is appreciated in whichever form it comes in, because I think Final Fantasy games have always been very good at justifying why magic operates the way it does in these various games and worlds, why it works the way it does with certain characters. Turning, however, to the evolution of gameplay mechanics in Final Fantasy, the application of magic has had a steady and then recently very sudden transition away from one form of delivery to another, going from something that was rooted in the inherent strategy and strategic pacing of the games in these turn-based and ATB-based combat systems into something that has sought to evolve and integrate into a very action-based and, for all intents and purposes, hack and slash melee sort of combat system that the most recent Final Fantasy games have sought to do. And it's prudent to note how large this gulf is between old and new, since Final Fantasy traditionally relied and indeed innovated quite heavily in the arena of turn-based game systems and how magic was specifically applied to that. So for example, Final Fantasy was one of the first game series to introduce time-based status magic like slow and stop and haste, and that worked precisely because of the turn-based or ATB nature of gameplay, where these statuses actually had a tangible effect. They also innovated on elemental resistance and weaknesses for certain enemies in the games, and so the role of magic and the nature of the games was much more strategic and evenly paced in these early to middling years, and that's up to and including this transition era, or golden era as many call it, where games like Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII, even titles like Final Fantasy XII made magic a very strategic tool within the games, even if it was via the menu systems, where we had materia pairing, junctioning, and the gambit system respectively. Coming to the more recent games in the anthology, we have titles like Final Fantasy XV, Final Fantasy XVI, and Final Fantasy VII Remake games, which have sought to fold magic in with a much more action-focused system design. Now, I've just recently started Final Fantasy XV again. This is very much what prompted this video, and while it's a game that I do enjoy, I really like Final Fantasy XV, perhaps in a different way to why I like other Final Fantasy games, but upon playing it again, I was immediately reminded of how much I don't care for the application of magic in this game. I've seen it described on forums as a grenade mechanic, which I think is pretty accurate. It's quite cumbersome, it's how it's used, the process of crafting it, using it, and really also the stripping down of magic to these base elements of fire, ice and thunder. These were met with varying degrees of criticism from various players depending on what they specifically wanted from the games. Some even felt that magic was basically an irrelevance or an afterthought in this game, and I think this speaks volumes to Square's difficulty in reconciling a formerly very strategic asset that slotted very neatly into, again, these former ATB systems with a more action-focused melee approach to game design. Final Fantasy XVI, for its part, built on this relating back to world and story, it was quite unique and ambitious with how it folded in the elemental summons into different combat variations and these learnable skills for Clive. But again, this was very much to do with the action-based combat and the skills that could be used there. But when it came to the actual casting of basic magic, much like Final Fantasy 15, it felt relegated to a barely even tertiary aspect to Clive's combat mechanics, and it resided primarily in the elemental magic that came from the summons, or in this case the icons, rather than anything that was particularly strategic or built out as we saw in the earlier titles. Turning to the Final Fantasy VII Remake saga, this is a really interesting one because it is of course revisiting a story and a set of systems that were established in 1997, of which of course the Materia system for magic was a well-regarded and very intrinsic part of that game. Now, this revisited system is interesting because it has sought to marry the immediacy of hack and slash combat with the nuance and pace of magic and the way magic was strategically used in these earlier titles. So as such, while the player does have freedom to roam around and attack at will, in the combat screen, there is still an ATB gauge that takes time to fill up, and it's depleted every time we use magic or use a special skill. So this system does then allow for strategic time-based magic like haste and slow to be reintroduced because they can affect this ATB gauge, this loading gauge. Magic once again auto-targets enemies instead of being used manually like a grenade in 15's, and there is a time-slowing aspect to when we filter through the menus. So that marries up and I think complements in its own way the immediacy of combat. We are taken out of that space to filter through and go through the menu selections for our magic casting. So I think actually that makes Final Fantasy VII Remake quite ambitious, and surprisingly I think it's unappreciated just how innovative its battle system was as a whole. This ability to marry up old and new, cycling through our party members so we can toggle through our party members, and of course the application of magic. I think it was really interestingly done. That being said, I think it's still fair to suggest that magic may be a secondary aspect to Final Fantasy VII's combat. There is a clear de-emphasis of toiling through the menu screens when we could have the immediacy and the flashiness of melee combat. For many players, it is perhaps a far cry from titles where you would arrange your party and arrange your magic based around what you want to achieve. So having a designated healer or a designated caster in your Final Fantasy VII party, and then you have your tanks. I think that's really kind of been diminished because pretty much anyone in Final Fantasy VII Remake can be a fighter class or a tank class if you really want. So a really interesting approach here that I think makes Final Fantasy VII, the remake games, quite unique, but also perhaps an exception to the prevailing rule and trajectory, since they are consciously trying to return mechanics that were used in an older game. So what does this all mean for magic in Final Fantasy? Is its relevance being petered out entirely into a secondary accessory due to the push towards fast-paced action? Personally, I think the games are going to loop back, if not towards a more ATB sort of approach, which many have called for, and Square have said to have acknowledged recently, apparently, owing to other recent successful turn-based games. But I think they're certainly going to loop back into something that has the essence of these charging bars or these ATB bars within an inherently action format. I think periodically Square has shown that they like to take stock and loop back to the thematic essence of what the series is. Final Fantasy IX is a classic example of that at the time and place that was released. I think as part of that they're going to re-look at magic, re-look at the role that magic plays and how it can work effectively in this sort of new era of faster paced sort of gaming, rather than sort of just go with these lopsided experiments that they tried in Final Fantasy 15 and Final Fantasy 16. And indeed, just as the ATB system, which debuted in Final Fantasy 4, became the foundation and the staple for the series over the next few games, it's fair to suggest that the popularity and success of the hybrid action system that featured in Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth may well become the same sort of standard for the subsequent games to come out of Square Enix. And if we look for a moment beyond Final Fantasy into what other both Japanese and Western RPGs are sort of doing, whether that's Elder Scrolls or whatever, we can see that it's not necessarily a mutually exclusive way to build out a game system. Action-centric gameplay and immediate gameplay doesn't come at the expense, and it doesn't mean that you can't build out alternative character classes or build out mages or casters or whatever. It's simply that the models being followed and the inspiration being taken so far by Square Enix in the modern Final Fantasy era, maybe even the game libraries that they are sort of building on top of, they are far more weighted towards melee than they are anything else. And as I say, I think there's been a clear sort of evidence that audiences, or some audiences, feel that Magic has been diminished in this respect. So in all, it would be great to see Magic reprioritised and refocused upon in later titles. And I feel relatively confident that they're going to look at this down the line, whether that's in the form of the fabled Final Fantasy IX remake or whatever, which would naturally, like Final Fantasy VII remake, have to focus on the mechanics that were utilised in that earlier game, which, as we know, focused on traditional job classes, mages, so on. So they'd have to square that circle down the line. But even irrespective of Final Fantasy IX remake, history shows that Square have a tendency to return to the drawing board every few years to look at what they're doing and look at how their games are being built. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider joining me on Patreon. Alternatively, if you feel like donating me a coffee, you can do so. The links are available below.